So again, just welcoming everyone. This is, we're well into our Civic Dialogue series for this fall, and we are happy to greet all of you here today. I'm Patty Robinson. I am the Faculty Director of Civic and Community Engagement at College of the Canyons, and I'm joined by Kimberly Rosenfeld, who is the Chair of Education and Chair of the Women's Studies and Women and Gender Studies program at Cerritos College, and is also working with 3CSN. Today, we're also joined, at least virtually, with Keelan Koenig, and Rebecca Moonstone will most likely join as well from our support team at our California Community Colleges Success Network group. So this program, or this dialogue series, began about 5 semesters ago. And it actually started out as part of a Bringing Theory to Practice grant that we were in the last part of the grant, and COVID hit. And we ended up having to figure out a way that we could still have a deliverable, but not in a live presentation. So we created this series, again, in a virtual format. We thought it would probably last 1 semester, and it's now going into its 5th semester, which we're incredibly excited about. As a result, this was a way that we saw that we could bring professionals, scholars, researchers, folks from around the country who are involved in civic and community engagement, and actually have this be a way that we can get that message out to individuals, particularly in the California Community College system. The sessions are recorded by 3CSN, and they are also archived. So this is a great way for folks who aren't here, and some of whom have contacted me today who wanted to be here and can't, they can go back and watch the recording, which is really, really nice. The presentation is comprised of 2 parts. We have our guest speaker. This is the conversation part where the presenter will talk about a particular topic. And then after the presenter is finished, our 2nd hour is our deep dive, where Kimberly and I will go into more discussion with folks who want to continue to really talk about the things that resonated with them in the 1st hour. The guiding frameworks of our session are to advance understanding of the intersection between equity, agency, and civic engagement. Also to recognize civic, community, and democratic engagement as a high impact practice, and particularly as it relates to guided pathways, and to also leverage participants' current knowledge to build capacity to innovate for local and global change. And with that, I'm going to move it over to Kimberly, who's going to introduce our incredible speaker today. So it's a great honor to welcome Nicholas Longo.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm going to read this brief bio that we put into the chat, but I think it's worth just taking a minute to read through it. So Nick Longo is a professor in the Department of Global Studies and a faculty fellow for Engaged Scholarship with the Center for Teaching Excellence at Providence College. He also co-directs the Dialogue, Inclusion, and Democracy Lab, which focuses on using deliberative, community-based pedagogies to promote equity and democracy. And he is a faculty mentor and board member of College Unbound, a college working to reinvent higher education for returning adult learners. I think all those sound really great and really nice, and I can't wait to hear what Nick has to say to us today. So welcome, Nick.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. I'm going to share my screen. Can everyone, if you give me a thumbs up, you can say, okay, great. And I'm going to put it in. So thank you so much for that introduction, and just for this series. I mean, I should say we actually just are finishing a Bringing Theory to Practice grant. We have a project with Brown University, the Swearer Center, and College Unbound, where we're investigating community partnerships. But with this Civic Dialogue series, you've set the bar so high in terms of what we can do to sustain our project. So thank you for doing that. And it's a really great example of how kind of small amounts of external funding can catalyze really exciting projects like this. So I'm just honored to be part of it. I'm also really glad to see Campus Compact here. I've just kind of returned to my early roots, and this year I'm a deliberative dialogue fellow with National Campus Compact. And the ideas I'll be talking about today are really just workshopping these ideas. These are kind of some research I've been doing with the Kettering Foundation that I'm going to be working on with Campus Compact this year. And I'm really excited to be in conversation with you all on these and how they're relevant and how we could really move forward on campus. I'll say from the start, my kind of way of being in the world is very participatory, engaging. I believe in the co-creation of knowledge. So I don't like one way kind of forms of sending information, you know, and I think this photo that you all see on this slide kind of helps to embody that. So this is a photo that I took. I was a couple of years ago. I was part of a summer course on social infrastructure at the University of Cape Town, and it's really interesting. I mean, these are all engineering students. You know, they go through a very traditional academic experience in South Africa and in their engineering program at UCT. But this is one course that kind of challenges that and tries to disrupt it. And so this one session really early in the semester was on this idea of knowledge. And there's 100 students from mostly from South Africa, but all over the South African continent. And they said, you know, who in this room, and the room is set up in very traditional rows. And they said, you know, if you speak another language, could you come up to the board and translate the word knowledge into that language? And pretty soon people are getting out of their seats, walking up to the front. And we had 20, 25 folks who spoke another language and who translated the word knowledge into their language. And this is the image as that kind of was taking place that I took. And I start with this because this is very much, I think, the way I think about the co-creation of knowledge is that we have so many untapped assets among us. And part of our work as educators, as facilitators, is to tap into that knowledge. And so that's why when I'm doing this session, you know, I'm going to try and have a couple of different pieces where people jump in and we get to share. And then I'm excited that, you know, at the end, we're going to have a lot of questions and there's a whole nother hour that's really dedicated to conversation. But it's all around this idea that, you know, knowledge is a co-creative process and that we all have assets to contribute. And that's really what kind of this session's around educating citizen professionals. I think that language is clunky, but it's something that I'm really interested in workshopping with you and kind of getting and going deeper and seeing what works around this. But the kind of core idea is how a different type of pedagogy. So this kind of pedagogy that we're going to be talking about today, this pedagogy that recognizes the assets in a co-creative process, and it's using civil discourse, how that kind of pedagogy can help us educate and create citizen professionals. And these are very much thinking about the connection between higher education's work as doing workforce development and preparing folks for jobs, and at the same time doing public engagement work and preparing democratic citizens. So how can we bring those two core missions together? And at the core of what I'm going to be talking about and thinking about with you is how pedagogy and a different kind of democratic pedagogy can be at the core of that. I want to tell you a little bit more about my story and kind of my how I came to this work, why I'm here with you today. So there's kind of three big shifts that I want to talk about. And I think these are kind of shifts in my story and my narrative, but they're also, I think, shifts that have taken place in the field of civic engagement. And the first is, you know, I grew up in a political family. My dad was a local politician. I went to the university and was studying political science. And this was the start of the really kind of contentious national politics. I was in college at the time of, you know, the first impeachment in Clinton and the government shutdown. And as a young person, and I think this is a thing I see with my students today, I just became disillusioned with traditional politics. Like I wanted nothing to do with that and kind of didn't see like that would be a place to make a difference. But I got introduced as a college student to service learning. And I was a serious student and I wanted to change the world. And what service learning allowed me to do was to see I didn't have to shift and I could be a whole person. My idea of being a student and my idea of changing the world could come together. And at the same time, it helped to disrupt and shift my idea of what politics was. And I began to see the work that I was doing, the relational organizing, the work with community partners as a form of politics, but it was really a citizen politics. And it was a big contrast to the politics that I was seeing in Washington, D.C. So I think that shift in politics is important. Kind of a second shift that I went through that I think is part of our larger field is a shift from an academic, you know, and I finished undergraduate, I wanted to get a traditional PhD and be an academic. And I realized pretty quickly from talking to folks and my mentors, and I was part of this project of publicly engaged scholars. And what I realized that there was this shift of the way that academics could understand their work. And it was a shift towards being a publicly engaged scholar. So that's kind of what that first slide I showed you with the knowledge is that you could bring that approach to your work as a scholar. So knowledge doesn't have to be created in kind of out of decontextualized way in a laboratory. It could be co-created through a publicly engaged process. And so my work as an academic, as a scholar, has really been trying to think through and put that shift into practice. And it's not always easy because our institutions are really set up for a much more traditional notion of scholarship. And kind of a third shift that I want to introduce in my story. So when I was a grad student, I actually worked at Campus Compact on something called the Raise Your Voice campaign. I went around the country talking to students how they understand education. I got introduced to something called the Highlander Folk School, which was this kind of democratic education model. And I began to see how different this model was that college students cared about, or that I was being introduced to with the Highlander Folk School, from that model that I had as a student growing up. I went to, very traditional. I went to a Catholic school. In my second grade teacher had up on the board, I must do what I am told, when I am told, by whom I am told, whether I like it or not. And so like most of our education system isn't that direct about, the way they see the kind of student-teacher relationship, but in kind of subtle and not so subtle ways, that's really the kind of banking model of education that dominates. It's like a professor or a teacher has the knowledge and it's imparting it on a student. And I was introduced to this other model of democratic education with the Highlander Folk School, with Campus Compact, with something I worked on called the Jane Addams School. And it began to shift my thinking about pedagogy and teaching and learning. And that's something that I'm going to really focus on today, is kind of what this looks like in practice. And out of this kind of final way to introduce myself, and I'm going to ask you to introduce yourselves as well, is I've been doing this activity with my students. It's called like just creating your 6-word memoir. It's been popularized. I think maybe Oprah did it, or there's different websites you can look at, and people do their 6-word memoir as a way to introduce themselves, introduce and think back and reflect on their lives. So as I was thinking for this session, what's my 6-word memoir for my work? And it's building community a little more democratic. So kind of the pieces that bring my work together is, building community a little more democratic. And kind of as a first way to get to know other folks that are on this Zoom call, I'm wondering if you all would be willing to introduce yourselves and write your 6-word memoir, and put your 6-word memoir into the chat. So I know some of you could be driving. Like I know like sometimes you just come and you just like, I just need to listen in. So if you're able to, I'm going to give you like 2 or 3 minutes. It doesn't have to be, this isn't going to be published. So it's just like a way to introduce yourself to the group. But if you would just take a minute, think about and reflect on like in your work in 6 words, what's your 6-word memoir of the work that you're doing? And add that into the chat. And I should say, like, so Kimberly, thank you for that. Yes, an asset-based approach to learning. In my teaching, when I was teaching, especially during COVID, when I was online, the thing I could always notice was like the best classes, the most engaged classes, we had conversations, like total engagement in the chat. So feel free to like write comments in the chat. I think, with the folks here, if you have questions, add them to the chat. You can start a conversation going on in the chat. So we'll have our kind of 6-word memoir. And then we'll also, throughout this session, feel free to add comments or questions in the chat as we go. So we've got our first memoir. Patty, thank you so much. Making real change that creates impact. Love it. Kimberly, connecting students to their community, technology and higher ed, media and identity formation. That's beautiful. We'll count that as 6 words in a.
I was gonna say, Nick, she cheated. That's over 6.
I know I'm not following directions very well.
We're gonna hyphenate a couple of those words. Ooh, I love this one. Servant leadership equals way of life. Fostering participation, grounded in trust and reciprocation. Love that. Thank you, Bobby. Shape-shifting to transform ourselves and communities. That's great. And excellent use of the dash to get a extra word in there. I love that. Learning, spreading knowledge, increasing awareness, making knowledge global. That's beautiful, Mitra. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
These are just beautiful. Yeah, I'll put the link when I have a little bit of time, if I have a second, to the 6-word memoir. This is just like a quick activity I would recommend, like you could do with your students. It's a great introductory activity. You know, you could do it in person, online, have people share theirs out and then talk about them. It's really kind of a quick way to get at what's meaningful in your lives. So what's at stake? So I talked about this crisis in democracy that we see all around us. I feel it, you know, I've kind of talked about it as a college student, my kind of disillusionment with politics, and it's only become more and more pronounced over the last few decades. And at this moment, I think we're probably in the biggest crisis, no doubt in my lifetime, but certainly for many decades. And I think there's 3 kind of overarching pieces of this. And this comes out of the research I've been doing with the Kettering Foundation. The Kettering Foundation is a research organization that looks at what it takes to make democracy work as it should. And the first piece of kind of challenge to democracy is just a loss of trust. We see this all around us. And it's a lack of confidence in government and in major institutions, or you look at almost, you know, any survey data shows us at all-time lows in terms of kind of, ordinary citizens' confidence in the major institutions. But I also want to add a second dimension to this, is that it's a lack of trust of major institutions in citizens, in ordinary people. And I think that's important, is that you see that in higher education. Later, I'm going to talk about an organization, a new university I work with called College Unbound. And College Unbound kind of shifts this notion of like, is it being, you know, we talk a lot in higher education about student ready. How do we get students ready for, you know, life in colleges and universities? And what College Unbound does is it shifts that and it says, how do we be an institution ready for students? So thinking about how to make the institution, you know, really a place that meets all the different needs and really recognizes the talents of their students. And I think the same thing is happening with the loss of trust, is that there's a loss of trust among citizens and institutions, but institutions don't set up mechanisms that say we really trust folks. You know, so if you're doing things like participatory budgeting in government or in higher education institutions, if you're doing things that really demonstrate a trust of students and faculty and staff, that's kind of trust goes both ways, I guess is what I'm saying. A second piece is the civic empowerment gap. So more and more we think about like the folks who are most engaged are kind of folks who are on the fringes on both sides, and people who are often the most disruptive to kind of really making a difference and being engaged and being productive. And so we see as a big piece of our crisis in democracy is that way too many ordinary citizens are just on the sidelines. You know, we have an expert model that invites participation from the extremes and special interest groups. How do we kind of, you know, if we want to really think about a democracy, that we've got to kind of shift that dynamic. So the second crisis point is that there's this kind of civic empowerment gap among ordinary citizens. And then a third is just adaptive challenges and wicked problems that can't be solved by technical expertise alone. You'll hear me and other folks talk about this idea of wicked problems, and those are, you know, you've probably heard this language, but you know, a wicked problem is a problem that's different from a technical problem. You know, when we were about to get ready for this webinar, for this workshop, you know, there were some technical issues with getting things set up on Zoom, and that's a technical problem that we can fix. You know, our crisis in education, racism, the kinds of issues that we're dealing with around climate change. And then newer kind of one I would frame around this as well is the crisis in democracy itself. Those are adaptive challenges. Those are wicked problems, and there's not going to be a technical solution. So to really address those kinds of challenges, these wicked problems, we need new ways of thinking and new ways of doing. And it's a crisis of democracy that these 3 kind of forces are coming together: a loss of trust, a civic empowerment gap, and a set of adapted challenges, which includes the challenge of you know, a loss of faith in democracy itself. So how do we respond to this crisis in democracy? For this session and for folks around this room, is we think about higher education as a kind of response, and higher education needs to advance democracy. And the language that people use around that kind of goes in two different ways. It's higher education advancing careers and higher education advancing the common good. And a couple examples of this. So one is like just came out, Georgetown University's Center for Education and the Workforce. They have they did a study where they did a return on investment of 4,500 different colleges, right? So they say like college is a huge investment. Folks want to get jobs out of that. They want to really use it of the mechanism. They use the kind of assessment measures around return on investment, ROI. And so like I just pulled one up just to kind of, you could see what these look like. So this is College of the Canyons, and they kind of show like what's the return on investment around, at the 10-year, there's a ranking for it. With community colleges, you'll see that the return on investment over the 10-year period, this is just what the indicators that they're using are much higher. And then over the long term, they get lower by the mechanisms they're using. But that's a pretty narrow set of measures that they're using. Their return on investment is really about getting jobs. And a second, and this is kind of the work that we're doing, the work that Campus Compact's doing. I think a lot of the work of the Civic Dialogues series is about the kind of democratic civic purposes of higher education. And, just one example of that, this is now about a decade ago, but it was probably the most prominent thing that came out was a crucible moment and really thinking about college learning and democracy's future. There's now a coalition of folks who are kind of really still trying to embed this in higher education called the Civic Learning and Democracy Engagement Consortium. That's AACNU and Campus Compact and a whole bunch of other folks that are a part of. And what this document did and what this kind of other mission is calling for is for higher education to embrace civic learning and democratic engagement as the undisputed educational priority for all of higher education. Right. So the undisputed educational priority, it's saying like higher education, is called to do and educate future citizens and do kind of public problem solving. A lot of folks more and more are seeing it as this first about is preparing for careers. Even like this morning, I was talking to my 13-year-old son. He said, "Why would you go to college besides, getting a job?" So like it's just like part of our larger culture is this idea that, higher education is for careers. You're seeing places like Florida and other people starting to say, like, maybe we need differentiated tuition based on what major you have. So really, there's this focus on higher education for jobs. We're also talking about a higher education for democratic citizenship. And the question I want to pose is this: are these just two ships passing in the night? Right? Are these two missions disconnected, two separate things? Or is it possible that there's ways to bring these things together? And that's the language, and it's clumsy language that folks are using around, citizen professionals. That comes from the language of Harry Boyd. Civic professionals, William Sullivan's been writing about that, and others. Democratic professionals, Albert Zur writes about that. So different ways to come at this simple idea that we need to bring together work and citizenship, right? And as we're educating this next generation, how do we bring those two things together? I want to offer a kind of a simple definition of kind of this work of citizen professionals as, someone who has a public identity and deliberative way of acting that enables them to share power, work collaboratively, and engage the public to address wicked problems. Right? So look at those different pieces. You have a public identity. So you think about yourself as more than just like, your job. You're also thinking about the public dimension. You have a deliberative way of acting. So you're really bringing other people into, it's not just a technocratic way of solving problems. And you do that by sharing power, right? So it's like empowering other folks, having them be part of the circle and the process, working collaboratively and engaging the public to address those wicked problems we talked about. Albert Zur talks about this as professional training, capacities, and authority to help people to solve problems together. And even more important, is to recognize the kinds of problems they need to solve, right? So how do I name problems? who's going to name those problems? It's often best to think about it instead of using professional language, expert language about like, how do folks who are most affected by the problem name those problems? And Zur asked this question that I want to kind of just have us think about is, how can professional actors help mobilize rather than immobilize, expand rather than shrink democratic authority? So that's kind of at the core of this idea of citizen professionalism. As the core of this work of connecting work and citizenship is thinking about how do we, mobilize rather than immobilize, right? Power rather than disempower, expand rather than shrink democratic authority. So here's a couple, like, the language is clumsy, and I'd welcome other folks to recommend what language do you like? What do you call folks that are doing this kind of work? But these are kind of the core traits that I think of is, you listen to local knowledge, you share tasks, you catalyze public participation among diverse communities, you facilitate constructive dialogue, you create a sense of inclusion and belonging, you recognize community assets, you empower marginalized and underrepresented voices, you improvise with creative and innovative responses, you learn as much as you teach, and you serve the public. Right, so here's kind of a list of different traits that folks who are bringing together kind of work and citizenship, you might call them citizen professionals, but they kind of practice these sets of traits. These are their aims. This is the way they go about doing their work. If you want to comment on any of those, if you want to like add other ones that you can think of, feel free to add that into the chat. And I'm gonna kind of go to the next slide, but feel free to kind of engage with any of these. So I do want to kind of stop and just say, like, a lot of this work is kind of a challenge to traditional notions of expertise. A lot of the way I've learned to think about it is kind of thinking about experts on tap rather than experts on top. So kind of you have tap into the expertise. But there are certainly areas that we still want expertise. We want that technical knowledge. And this is like a New Yorker cartoon that I love. And it kind of is a reminder for me is, and I just flew last week, so I can relate to this. These smug pilots have lost touch with regular passengers like us. Who thinks I should fly the plane? So like there are areas in technical knowledge that kind of notions of expertise are essential, things like flying the airplane that we don't want to democratize. But solving adaptive problems, solving wicked problems, thinking about them, those are areas where we're going to need expertise, but we want to shift the way that we use expertise to solve those problems because they're not technical problems that can be solved by technocratic ways of knowing or doing. So what does this look like? What is this shift from outside expert to citizen professional? This is a chart that Harry Boyd put together from the Citizen Solution that I just wanted to introduce to you. And it's the outside expert, kind of the traditional dispassionate professional, thinks of their work as they do this because it's like altruistic service. And citizen professionals a shift towards a co-creative joint problem solving. It's kind of why you do this work. Who's in charge? Experts versus citizens, with both professionals and amateurs working together. If you're the expert, you're going to go in and you're going to fix the problem for people, right? This is like, I've got the expertise. I'm going to go into a community, it's often not my own community. I'm going to fix it for them. And with citizen professionals, what you're doing is you're working to solve problems while also building community ties. Your method is kind of expert intervention in traditional outside expertise model. With citizen professional, you're doing public work. And that's this idea of a diverse group of people coming together to do sustained work, public work, kind of the traditional older idea is the civilian conservation corps, where people came over and you do kind of the barn raising idea of like helping your neighbors, even though they might not be your best friend, but you're working together to solve a problem. Approach to teaching and learning. So kind of outside expert would be didactic. As one way knowledge being passed along, whereas the citizen professional model is apprenticeship model, relational model, conveying a craft and a heritage, So it's a different way. It's a different language even to think about it. The sources of knowledge is, outside expert model is kind of abstract theory and book learning. Those things are important. So then that's like, but if you also, a citizen professional needs to have those things, but then they're also thinking about local situations, experience, practice, as well as theory. The skills set for kind of outside expert is disaggregation, analysis, application, whereas in citizen professional is synthesis, integration, contextual understanding, relationship building, the role of professional as a service provider versus a catalyst or a facilitator. So this is kind of like, this is the shift that we're beginning to talk about. I'm gonna ask a question now of you all. How are we doing? If we kind of think about our work as educating the next generation of citizen professionals, the next generation of folks who have these traits over on the right-hand side, how are we doing at that? And as a way to kind of ask how we're doing at that is Parker Palmer talks about this idea. It's just like Parker Palmer writes just beautifully and talks beautifully about education and kind of the idea of an undivided life and like bringing yourself together and your vocational calling. And he has this idea that he introduced that it's kind of struck with me, is the kind of idea of the tragic gap. And the tragic gap is kind of where we're all kind of living in that tragic gap. And the tragic gap is kind of like the tension between the world as it is and the world as it should be, or the world as we'd like it to be. And so I think about this a lot in terms of this ideal of the work that we're doing in higher education, where we're trying to build a better world, a more whole world, a just world, an equitable world. And so if you think about it in terms of this educating citizen professionals, think about your own. What is your ideal for educating citizen professionals? What would the ideal be? Like, what would your university look like? What kind of curriculum would you have? What kind of relationship with students would you have? How would community partners would be involved? And what kind of, joint problem solving would be going on? How would courses be sustained and developed? So just like imagine your dream university, how it is, what it could be, and kind of as an idea for educating citizen professionals. And then also like, what's the reality? Like if your universities are like mine, morale is low, students are, and I think faculty and staff, there's kind of a post-traumatic stress that's going on. There's real mental health challenges. There's, pressure from administrators and external forces, legislators are kind of saying what you can and can't teach, budget crises. So like there's kind of this disconnect between the ideal of what educating citizen professionals might be and the reality. And kind of as a way to get at this, I'm gonna ask you all, so this is our second chance to have a little kind of short engagement. I'm gonna I have to just stop sharing my screen for 2 seconds to pull up this this link. So I don't know if folks have used Jamboard before, but it's really easy. It's engaging. This is a great tool for you to do stuff with your students. So if you go to this link here on the right and click on it, I'll share my screen so you can kind of see what it's going to look like. And there's two different pieces to this. So I see you're all joining it. So what is your ideal for educating future citizen professionals is the first one. And then if you click on the second one, you can go to this, what is your reality in higher education today? So kind of two pieces, your ideal and kind of the reality. And the way you add things to Jamboard is you could just on this left-hand side, so you could just add a sticky note. So let's just say my ideal, let's just say democratic education, just to give you an example. You save it. And now we've got the sticky note of a democratic education as an example of kind of what my ideal. So I'm again just going to give you a couple of minutes to add to this Jamboard. So add to your ideal on this one. And then on the second one, that over to the right. So you just click over here. What is your reality of higher education today? Any questions about this process? And I'm going to catch up on the chat while you're doing this to see if there's any, like, and I'll bring those into the conversation as best I can. But anybody have any questions about using the Jamboard?
Yeah, Nick, it seems like you have to download the app in order to open. I mean, for me, at my end, it shows I'm on my cell phone. So I have to.
Oh, on a phone. I'm sorry. Yes. A phone might not work as well as a computer in the sense. So if you want, if you're on a phone, feel free to post something in the chat.
Thank
On a
you.
computer, you should be able to get right to it. But on a phone, yeah, you do know, I think you need to have a Google app. So I apologize for that. But you feel free to just add something in the chat and we could add it to the Jamboard. Yeah, and this is just going to be a couple of minute activity just to kind of get people's sense. And I think we'll continue this conversation, I'm sure, after when we get into the second half of this. But if you want to add to the chat, if you're not able to get to the Jamboard, kind of what is your ideal for educating future citizen professionals? And then the second piece is kind of what is your reality today? So we'll come back to this tragic gap. And kind of how you're seeing your work, and that could be part of the grist for our conversation. But what I want to introduce to you all, and the way I've been thinking about it, is this idea that teaching and learning as the practice of democracy, as a way to get around that tragic gap, and as a way for educating citizen professionals to kind of move towards my ideal. And I've been inspired by, I mentioned the Highlander Folk School. The Highlander Folk School was, and it still exists today. It was founded by Miles Horton. It was kind of the core democratic educational space during the labor movement, the civil rights movement. And it has a pretty simple idea. You get folks together in a circle. The folks who are most affected by the problem talk about it and kind of do joint problem solving, collectively thinking about how they can make a change. The most famous student was Rosa Parks the summer before the Montgomery bus boycott. But Miles Horton says, and this has had a big impact on me, the best ways of educating people is to give them an experience that embodies what you're trying to teach. When you believe in a democratic society, you provide a setting for education that's democratic. So I think about, like, where are the spaces that I can control? You know, my classroom, the spaces on my campus. How can I make those spaces more democratic, more like the type of experience I want students to have? You know, when I worked with Campus Compact with Raise Your Voice, one of the kind of biggest takeaway for me, you know, I went around the country, talked to students for 2 years, and I talked to them about civic engagement and democracy. My biggest takeaway was that young people see right through hypocrisy. And when you talk about democracy, you know, they're often see it as like, they learn democracy and what it means to be democratically engaged by how it's practiced in their lives and on campus. So if we want to think about educating, you know, citizen professionals, democratic citizens, we've got to introduce them to spaces, democratic spaces on campus. Right? And we can do that in our classroom. We can do that in other spaces that we have a lot of control over. And then we can start kind of building ecology of those kind of democratic spaces on campus. So our classroom can be spaces where we're educating democratic civic professionals. You know, I could see my role as a citizen professional in the way I do my teaching. Right? If I'm going to want my students to be engaging the public in a different way and not in a technocratic way, then that's the way I need to operate and engage with my students in the classroom. It's kind of the core of this idea of, you know, teaching and learning as the practice of democracy. This has kind of been something that we've been working on with a group with the Kettering Foundation. For about the last decade, we did a book called Deliberative Pedagogy, and more recently a book called Creating Space for Democracy, which I edited with Tim Schafer. And it's really about this idea of deliberative pedagogy is about democratizing teaching and learning. So it centers engaging civil discourse about complex and divisive issues. It's a reflective practice that helps students develop democratic skills, asset-based approach that really is teaching the skill of, you know, seeing multiple perspectives, weighing trade-offs and tensions, and going towards purposeful action. And it's about space making, you know, creating and holding space for authentic and productive dialogue practices that can ultimately not only educational, but transformative. In the book, Nancy Thomas is one of the authors. I know she's been part of the Civic Dialogues series. I think she was the last speaker. And she talks about sharing responsibility involves relinquishing some control. But if everyone around the table believes they're making discussion work, they may voluntarily curb behaviors that add no value without inhibiting the robust exchange of ideas. This book, and I'll ask Patty if she sends out, if anyone's interested in it, I could send a code to get, I think it's a 25% discount on it. So it's got a whole bunch of different case studies from different campuses about how they're creating democratic space in student affairs, in academic life, in community partnerships. I think it could be a really good resource for you.
And Nick, I just want to highlight that too. It is a wonderful book. So for all of you who are interested in this work, definitely worth the investment.
Well, thank you, Patty. I'm gonna bring you around with me all the time to give agree with it, because that's so affirming and I really appreciate it. So this deliberative pedagogy, what does this look like? What are the principles, practices, outcomes of it? A principle, active citizenship is learned through practice, right? Really simple idea, but what are the practices? How do you do that? You build civil discourse in your work and you're building democratic skills. Knowledge is co-created. What are practices? Choice work, where you teach students to kind of name and frame issues and think through deliberatively how you make decisions and deal with different trade-offs. And the outcome of that is public judgment. And then education should respond to wicked problems. So you do an asset-based community development approach, and the outcome is purposeful action. There's a set of democratic skills, and these are in a toolkit I'm going to introduce to you. So I'm not going to go through these in any depth way, but there's a toolkit that we're doing with Campus Compact that kind of has a whole assessment tool that you can use to kind of build these into your work. But these are a set of democratic skills and the practices that go along with them. So these are if you think about educating citizen professionals, these are a set of democratic skills that we want our students to learn, because they'll be more effective as professionals in both in connecting work and in solving in connecting work with public problem solving. So we want the ability to share your public narrative. That comes out of Marshall Ganz's work, and think about story of self, us, and now. The ability to listen eloquently, right? So not speak eloquently, listen eloquently. Naming and framing issues. A whole kind of the ability to ask, what's the issue? Think about it from the perspective of people most affected, and then frame it in a way that you can really engage in constructive dialogue. Collaborating with the diverse set of stakeholders, facilitating those constructive dialogues. So really a skill set about being a facilitator, engaging in that kind of public work that I talked about before, as defined by Harry Boyd, and then also reflecting on that community practice. So reflection and assessment and kind of reframing your work being a key component of it. So two quick examples, and then we're going to wrap up. One is kind of how we're putting this into practice at Providence College. We just launched a project called Conversations for Change. It's led by our Dialogue, Inclusion, Democracy Lab. And what we're trying to do with Conversations for Change is get our campus talking to each other. And we've got these democracy walls around campus. You can see one of them right there on the right. We've now got 5 different democracy walls. There are ways for people to engage and ask questions. The very first question we asked was, what differentiates hate speech and free speech? Kind of a core challenge we're having in higher education right now. A lot of folks are talking about it. We wanted to engage the community, our campus community, around questions like that. And it was because of a tension that happened on our Catholic campus around first bringing a speaker onto campus who was, kind of had views that the Catholic Church kind of thought was controversial, but I don't think that it was. And then a second was a billboard issue. These are kind of tensions that, and actually both cases ended up being national news stories. And we think if we are able to create democratic space on campus, and have spaces for democracy walls, be educating citizen professionals, build it into our classrooms, then it won't be these kind of one-off, really controversial issues. We'll build a culture of dialogue on campus. And so we're trying to do that. This is a quote from one of our students who we introduced and had a whole series of activities around citizen professionalism. You could read the quote, but we will not make headway against the tide unless we all row together. Instead of being detached experts who talk to people, we need to find creative ways to inspire dialogue. And kind of a second case study is at College Unbound. I'm a faculty mentor and on the board of College Unbound. College Unbound is the newest accredited campus in New England, in Rhode Island. And it's a campus for adult learners who are returning to school and are trying to shift and make their lived reality the center of the curriculum. There's 3 different components to that curriculum. There's a cohort learning, kind of a lab, where they work with in a cohort experience over the time at College Unbound with an advisor, and they're working on a project. So everything's centered around the project. They're working on that in their lab. A second piece of it is instructional courses that are online, and all their courses in some ways connect back to their project. So it's really centered on their lived experience. And then a third piece is learning in public, these LIPs. And it's finding ways to give credit and recognize prior learning in a way that honors and validates adults. And so my experience teaching at College Unbound has really kind of transformed the way I understand citizen professionalism, in the sense that, Providence College, I'm working at traditional 18 to 22-year-olds. It's often them thinking about what kind of work I'm going to do in the future. How can I be a citizen professional in the future? With College Unbound, we're working and introducing this concept in the work with adults who are engaged and who are leaders in their community. They just might not have a credential yet. And so they see citizen professionalism very differently. And it's often the experience that they've had of professionals coming into their communities. And this is a quote from one of our CU students that I had, where she says, I've always felt that professional experts would come into a community, research and study our community, and come back with solutions they felt were the best solutions for our community. And they would talk to us, about us, without us. So introducing a term like citizen professionalism and kind of that work in a context like a community college might be very different from a college that's working with 18 to 22-year-olds. And so it's a rich idea, and the ability to bring folks together and talk about it and kind of argue about what it means and how we put that into practice is a kind of a rich area of exploration. And it's got to be centered on our pedagogy. This is wanted to introduce and let you know that I've been building this set of tools for educating citizen professionals. And Campus Compact is going to publish this as a toolkit. Right now it's titled Practicing Democracy, a toolkit for facilitating civic solutions. And this is meant to be a really useful guide that has 13 different lesson plans around shaping culture, developing the concepts, building skills, and putting it into practice. And then there's an assessment and reflection piece around those skills that I had introduced earlier. This is a guide that will be published. It's a digital publication. It's going to be available through Campus Compact, I think free of charge, starting in January. So I wanted to just let you know that this is coming, that this toolkit hopefully will be useful for you all in your work. So final 2 pieces. These are the 2 slides just to kind of like step back and say thank you for being part, and thanks for the organizers of the Civic Dialogues series. I think like Civic Dialogues and the work of Civic Dialogues is a foundation for educating citizen and civic professionals. And these 2 cartoons are kind of fun ways to think about like why this is important. Why we spend time on Civic Dialogue is, more and more we're in a culture where facts don't matter, and the loudest voices often try to get their way. And at the same time, we have tensions around free speech and cancel culture. And college and universities are kind of staging grounds for some of these tensions. So we really have to know and learn how to do civic dialogues. And if we were in person, I might have you do this chant together, but we have kind of our slogan for the Civic Dialogue series that we can use. And it's like, what do we want? Respectful dialogue, respectful discourse. When do we want it? Now would be agreeable to me, but I'm interested in your opinion. So it doesn't exactly come off the tongue. I've been part of protests where the chants are much more powerful, but it's a way of thinking about the kind of work we're doing in this civic discourse series. So I'm going to stop there. It looks like we're just about at 2 o'clock. So we're just about ready for the kind of interactive, engaging piece. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I said I need to jump off because I have to get somewhere across town, be somewhere for 3. But it's this has been so wonderful. I'm so thankful for this Civic Dialogue series. Thankful for you all. Put my email in the chat and would love to be able to stay connected with you all. So thanks so much.
Thank you again, Nick, for joining us today.